This is the Walksnail Goggles X. It's a new FPV goggle for Walksnail's Avatar digital FPV system. And my first thought when it came out was, what's wrong with this? This is the Walksnail Avatar goggle, or Fat Shark Dominator HD, depending on who you bought it from, and it's the goggle that the Walksnail FPV system launched with, and it's a pretty good goggle. So what does the new Goggles X bring to the table that motivated Walksnail to release it so relatively soon in their development cycle? And the big question, of course, should you get it? I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. There are a lot of FPV systems out there that you could choose. Analog, HDZero, DJI V2, DJI O3, and of course, Walksnail. And as much as I would like to make this video be everything you need to know to help you decide whether the Walksnail goggles are the right ones for you to buy, we just can't do that. This isn't going to be a video about choosing between the different systems. I've got that video. I made that video in early 2023. I'm going to link that video down in the video description below. And if you're not sure which of these systems is best for you, what the pros and cons of each of them are, you should go watch that video. Yes, it's coming up on a year old now, but it's still pretty much just as relevant as it ever was in helping you make that decision. No, as we go into this video, we're going to more or less assume that you have settled on the Walksnail video system as the one that you would like to be using. And the big question is, should you be getting these new goggles, or should you be sticking with the older V1, the Dominator or Avatar goggles, especially now that they're being marked down really substantially in price now that this new generation of goggles is coming. And we'll start out by saying that the basic capabilities and functions of the Goggles X are the same as the V1 Avatar goggle. This is still a Walksnail goggle, and it still works with the current generation of the Walksnail video system. So it has 1080p OLED screens, same as the original goggles, and it supports all of today's current generation of video transmitters, the normal video transmitter, the micro, the 1S video transmitter, and all of the video modes that they support. So far, you're probably not that impressed with the Goggles X. They pretty much are a cosmetic upgrade, or depending on your aesthetic choices, a downgrade from the original Avatar goggles. What do they actually bring to the table that is new in terms of functionality? Now, here's one thing. The Goggles X have an HDMI input, which is something that the original Avatar goggles were missing. In fact, the Avatar goggles had no way whatsoever to get external video into them, which means that they worked with the Walksnail Avatar system and literally nothing else. The HDMI input means that you can use these goggles with, well, anything that outputs HDMI. Your computer, you could use them to play simulator. You could use them to watch movies. And of course, you can use them with any other digital FPV system, which basically means the HDZero standalone receiver, which can output HDZero feeds. So in theory, we could mount an HDZero receiver on the front of these goggles somehow, and then have a dual system. But not just dual system, because the goggles also have an AV input for analog receiver. Now, the analog receiver is not going to be as nicely integrated as something like the HDZero goggles, because the HDZero goggles have a built-in module bay that takes the actual module and holds it right on the side of the goggles. It's a little bit clunky. Frankly, I wish they were smaller, but it is a single piece unit, and that's nice. Of course, it would be nicer if the goggles had a module bay so that the module could just be enclosed in the goggles, but I guess that's too much to ask. And let's face it, a lot of people aren't flying analog anymore anyway. So you're going to need something like this little adapter if you do decide to use the goggles with an analog receiver. You'll take your analog receiver module, like this rapid fire module, you'll plug it into the adapter, like so. It takes power right here from a battery, and then you take a cable like this little cable that came with the module, and it plugs in there and plugs in to the AV input on the goggles, and they can be used as an analog goggle. And for all I know, someone is right now working on a 3D print that will like nicely mount this module up on top of the goggles or something like that and make it a package. But for the time being, it's just going to be, you're going to have to find some way to stick that on or mount it. In addition to HDMI in, we've also got HDMI out. And that's something that the original Avatar goggles sort of had. The original Avatar goggles have a USB output, USB-C, and that USB-C output can also output HDMI using a USB-C to HDMI cable. But it is nice to have an actual HDMI out. For one thing, the USB-C output was just a little bit loose and wiggly, and sometimes it would lose connection even though it was technically plugged in. The actual HDMI is more secure. We do have to mention that this is a mini HDMI, not a full-sized HDMI, so it's not going to be quite as secure as a full-size HDMI, and you are going to need an adapter or a specialized cable in order to use it. Your standard HDMI cables won't fit in these plugs. Like the original Avatar goggles, the Goggles X have adjustable interpupillary distance. The screens can move in and out to center them in front of your eyes, and they have adjustable focus. You turn these knobs to adjust the focus between +2 and -6 diopters. I have to say, though, so my prescription is -625 in one eye and -675 in the other eye. So if the goggles only go to -6, I shouldn't be able to get a perfectly focused image because I'm outside that range. But on the original Avatar goggles, I actually didn't have to turn the knobs all the way to the end. I would turn them to the end and they would get sharp and then go out of focus again, and I'd turn them back slightly. I always felt like the original Avatar goggles said that they were +2 to -6, but they actually went closer to like -7 or -8. And I will say that on the Goggles X, they are just barely not quite in focus yet when I turn them all the way to the edge of their adjustment. I can still use them. Like if I kind of half squint my eyes, I can kind of like make them come into focus, but it is a little bit annoying. And if you, like me, are at the edge of the prescription range, you may find that you want custom lenses. For those who have very narrow or very wide set eyes, the Goggles X claim to have a wider IPD range, 54 to 72 millimeters, whereas the original goggles were 57 to 70 millimeters. However, I don't know how much faith we should put in that, because a lot of times manufacturers feel like they're fudging a little bit on these measurements. We just look at them side by side, like the Goggles X do look narrower. A little hard to tell if I've got it lined up right, but they look slightly narrower. And if we put them at their widest, they do look slightly wider. Obviously, you're not going to be able to tell for sure until you put them on your face, but if you are somebody who is a little bit outside the normal IPD range, these goggles may work for you. Well, let's stop talking about the new features that these goggles have and actually try them out. I've got here a screen with an HDMI input. We're going to plug that into the HDMI output on the goggles, and we're going to see what they can do. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to bind them to this Rotor Riot Skyliner with a Walksnail video transmitter in it. And some people who are watching this video are new to the Walksnail system and might be saying, I wish you would tell me how to bind the goggles, how to do the firmware update, how to set up the flight controller and all that stuff. That's not going to be in this video, but I do have it in another video as part of my 2023 beginner build series, where I show you how to build and configure an FPV drone from start to finish. One of the chapters in that series is about the Walksnail video transmitter. I'll put a link to that in the video description. If you're just getting into this system and you want to get it set up and get it ready to go, that is where you should go. Let's get this bound and see how it works. In order to power the goggles up, we're going to use this power cable that comes with the goggles. They are rated for 2S to 6S input, so this is just a straight pass-through XT60 to DC barrel plug. We'll go ahead and power them up. The first thing I did was plug in an HDMI cable to the HDMI output to allow me to view the feed from the Walksnail video transmitter on the external screen. And that worked as expected. Do bear in mind that if you have the Walksnail system set to high frame rate, then it's running at 100 frames per second, and 100 frames per second will also be what comes out of the HDMI output. And the reason that matters is that many screens and capture cards can't handle 100 frame per second 720p, in which case you'll get like, I got an invalid format message on my screen. If you're running into that problem, you may need to take the Walksnail system and change from high frame rate to standard frame rate. This will change it down to 60 FPS FPS. It will increase the latency of the system, but if your screen can't display the 100 frame per second feed, that may be what you have to do. Next, I plugged my phone into the goggles through an HDMI adapter, and my phone's image appeared inside the goggles, but interestingly, the external screen once again said invalid format. And this was pretty confusing to me because, like, the goggles are a 1080p display. They're displaying my phone's image. Why isn't the external display displaying my phone's image? And I think the reason for it is that the goggles are passing the HDMI feed directly from input to output. It just passes through, and whatever resolution and frame rate comes in also goes out. But it must be the case that the goggles are doing some kind of scaling or resizing internally to allow the phone's image, which granted the phone is a weird resolution, to allow that phone's image to appear inside the goggles, and that scaling and processing is not being done between the input and the output. That's probably a good thing because it probably means that the latency on this pass-through is as low as possible. Finally, I tested the HDZero goggles feeding from their HDMI output into the HDMI input of the Goggles X. And the idea here is, could you use the Goggles X as a receiver for an HDZero system if you had the standalone HDZero receiver? And the answer appears to be yes, it works as expected. However, if you're thinking that the Walksnail Goggles X will give you all of the features of the Walksnail system and all of the features of the HDZero system by pairing them with a standalone HDZero receiver, you're not quite right there. Because the standalone HDZero receiver cannot output the 90 FPS mode that gives you the lowest possible HDZero latency. And many people feel that this is one of the most desirable features of HDZero. So as long as you're happy using HDZero in 60 FPS mode, you can put a standalone HDZero receiver on these goggles through the HDMI input and use these as an HDMI receiver. The analog functionality of the goggles works as described previously, with a receiver module and a cable going into the AV input. And I'm extremely happy to learn that the goggle does output the analog feed on the HDMI output. This is something that I first saw on the HDZero goggles, and it's super nice because, like, well, those of you who never flew in the analog only world, or maybe the analog world at all, don't remember what a pain in the butt it was to get your analog feed onto a modern television that doesn't have a standard sort of analog video input. If you still fly analog, and if you want to get your analog feed onto a screen, like at a tiny whoop race or something like that, you can do it with a simple HDMI cable. That's fantastic. Well, there's only so much we can learn about these goggles by talking about them on the bench, so it's time to put them on my face, put a quadcopter in the air, and see what it's like to fly them. And I gotta say, the increased field of view of these goggles is already giving me a little bit of problem. So these goggles have a 50-degree field of view, which means the screen is just a little bit bigger in your eyes than the V1s, which was, I think it was 46 degrees field of view. And that difference is just enough that, like, the lower corners of the screen are really hard to get fully visible and fully in focus. It's really, if I move the eyepiece so that I can see the corners of the screen, then they're far enough apart that the two images don't line up. And if I move the images inward so they line up, I kind of can't see the lower corner of the screen. I wish that they had an option in software to shrink the screen down like the DJI-03 does. That would be nice. Anyway, let's put it in the air. I really love this camera. This is the Pro camera, and it does really well in the daylight, but it does excellent at night. It's a really good low light camera. I think it's a great all-around camera. As far as the goggles go, in some sense, there's not that much to say. Oh, I have to remember where I'm standing. I'm standing under these trees. I don't usually stand here. In some sense, there's not that much to say about the goggles. The optics themselves, or rather the screens, the displays, are the same 1080 OLED, 100 frame per second. They're the same micro display that's used in, like, all of the modern goggles. The DJI Goggles 2, the original Walksnail goggles, and the HDZero goggles. They're the same display, and the reason they're the same display is this Sony display is like the only 100 frame per second high frame rate micro display that you can get. I think Sony makes it for their cameras. So the image quality is very good. The optics I have nothing to complain about except for the large field of view making the edges difficult to see. As far as the faceplate goes, there is a little bit of light leak down near my cheekbones. They don't have perfect contact with my cheekbones, and there's a little bit of pressure on my nose. I always put aftermarket faceplates on my goggles with a little bit more padding to give me a little bit more room. In order to test the analog performance of the system, I've got this little module bay adapter that was originally designed for the DJI V2 goggles. And you just take an analog receiver module, this is the Immersion RC Rapid Fire, one of the best ones you can get today, and you plug it in there. I'm sure that a more elegant 3D printed solution either already does or will exist, but this is what we're going for today. I am happy to see that the goggles are correctly letterboxing the image. An earlier version of the firmware that was on the goggles when I first received them, the goggles were stretching the image, and that's just unacceptable. An analog image should be 4:3. I don't know what firmware you're going to have when you get your goggles, but you should definitely update it to the latest because Walksnail is constantly improving and fixing, and the firmware that's on the system when you get it may be significantly worse than the firmware that you could be using. This feels okay. The latency doesn't feel terrible. I wish that I had the ability to adjust brightness, contrast, and so forth. I don't think that's possible. I've messed around with the menu. And on analog goggles, like sometimes the camera is just a little jacked up. And you want to adjust those settings in your display. Oh, looks like my battery's low. So it's unfortunate, but these are, they're not first and foremost an analog goggle. So that's okay. But there is something that these goggles do with an analog feed that is pretty weird, and I'm not sure everyone's going to consider it a deal breaker, but you should definitely know that it's there. Here, let me demonstrate. I'm going to go into the menu of my Rapid Fire, and I want you to see what happens. Did you see that for just a fraction of a second the menu appeared and then static appeared? Where did that static come from? There's no reason for there to have been static there. See, it did it again. Did you see there was a different static there for just a fraction of a second? And then this static, it did it again. It did it again. What I've done is I've put the goggles on a channel let's put it on a channel that there's nothing on, race 6, and exit. For just a second, that's real static. That's real analog static that we saw there. What's happening here is that these goggles are blue screening. You know how a lot of displays, including the V2 DJI goggles, when they get a weak signal and they can't make anything of it, they go to a blue screen, or in the case of the DJI goggles, they go to the DJI logo. That's not that weird for a display, but for an analog goggle, you don't want that. A properly designed analog goggle will not blue screen. It'll just show you the static. So if you're an analog pilot flying these goggles, you should know that they are not going to behave like an analog goggle would, even though they show static when they have no signal. They're actually just going to suddenly go to this fake static when the signal gets weak enough, and that can really surprise you. I've had the signal drop out at surprisingly close range, and I don't have a really good explanation for it. I will say the signal comes back pretty quickly. Unlike the DJI goggles where the signal kind of goes away and stays gone forever, it did do a pretty good job of coming back when it went away. But if I'm flying analog, I don't want the signal to do that, and I can't decide whether it's fair to compare these to the DJI V2 goggles, in which case they're doing a little bit better, or whether it's more fair to compare them to like the HDZero goggles, which behave as an analog goggle should. I guess that's a decision for you to make. Another thing that I wanted to do was test the latency of these goggles. Now, the latency of the Walksnail system itself is reported inside the goggles. You can see the latency down at the bottom of the screen, and that is generally been verified to be more or less accurate by folks like Chris Rosser and Ian Lewis, Madstech. Those guys are set up with high-speed $700 cameras, 1,000 frames per second, and systems that they use to measure the latency of these and other goggles. And whenever I think about buying the same camera for $700, I think to myself, should I spend $700 or should I just trust their numbers? And so far, the answer has always been, I trust their numbers. So credit to them. Actually, I was talking with Madstech today, and he said, I don't know why you're trying to measure these things. Why don't you just point people to my numbers? And I thought, okay, I'll take you up on that. So Madstech says that the latency of the Walksnail reported latency that they show in the goggles is reasonably accurate, about 21 milliseconds to 25 milliseconds in the high frame rate mode, and that goes up as you get further and further away and the signal gets weaker and weaker. For the AV input and the HDMI input, the latency of the AV input is whatever the latency of your camera is, and the latency of analog cameras varies significantly, but it's whatever the latency of your camera is plus about 15 or 16 milliseconds. In other words, approximately 1 frame of data at 60 frames per second. And that's about as good as most systems are going to do. It is worth pointing out that the HDZero goggles and most analog goggles that are actually designed to be first and foremost analog goggles do better. They will have approximately the latency of the camera plus 1 or 2 milliseconds at most, and that gets that latency down as low as it possibly could be. But still, compared to something like the DJI V2 goggles, this is pretty good latency for an analog system in a first and foremost digital goggle. As far as the HDMI input goes, I measured a latency of about 25 milliseconds when used with a 60 frame per second HDZero camera and the HDZero goggles outputting into the HDMI input of these goggles. For comparison, the HDZero goggles themselves, used in the same conditions, have a latency of about 17 milliseconds. So in other words, the HDMI input of these goggles is adding maybe 6 or 8 milliseconds of delay, which is probably about as good as you could expect to get. I would say that the AV input and the HDMI input on these goggles is probably going to be usable for most people, but not the absolute best for anybody. But then if you wanted the absolute best HDZero system or the absolute best analog system, you would buy a goggle that was tailored specifically for that. But the big question I keep coming back to is, should you buy the Goggles X, or should you save about $80 at the time that I'm making this video and buy the Fat Shark Dominator goggles, which are on sale at Rotoride at least? You can still get them, and they still work with all the Walksnail video transmitters available today. How much are these goggles bringing to the table, and is that $80 worth of goodness? I'm going to answer that question for you just as soon as I tell you about my Patreon. Patreon is a website where you can subscribe to me for as little as $2 a month, or more if you feel like I've earned it. The amount you subscribe at is totally up to you. Just think about how much value you get out of my content. Problems that I've helped you solve, stuff that I've taught you. Maybe I've helped you make a better buying decision by buying a product that's right for you, or not buying a product that had some problem you didn't know about. Or maybe I just entertain you. Some people find me entertaining. Whatever it is, ask yourself how much that dollar amount is to you, and head on over to my Patreon, linked in the video description below, and sign up. You'll get access to my Discord server, which is full of friendly, helpful people who want to talk about FPV, help you solve problems, etc. Some people say it's the single best reason to join my Patreon. But whatever your reason is, if today's the day that you feel like I have earned your support, head to the link in the video description, patreon.com, and sign up. I'd love to have you as a supporter. And if today is not that day, that's okay. I'm going to keep making content. I hope you keep watching the content, and maybe that day will come. Should you buy these Walksnail Goggles X, or should you buy the V1 Dominator goggle for about $80 cheaper? $380 versus $460, I believe, is the price as of the time that I'm making this. And the number one reason to buy the new Goggles X is that Walksnail says that they are planning to release a new second generation FPV system, And it's supposed to have 4 to 5 times the range of the current system. That's a big, big promise. And when I first heard that promise, I thought that's marketing BS. How could Walksnail just snap their fingers and have 5 times the range of their previous system? And then I learned that the reason they're saying that is that the company that makes the chipset that goes in here. See, Walksnail doesn't make this hardware, this silicon themselves. They buy a chipset from a third-party company that has a radio and has the circuitry and code to do all this stuff. And then Walksnail goes in and they tweak the knobs and dials and they put a lot of effort into making it work like we want it to work. But they don't make the underlying machinery. And the company that makes that underlying machinery, that chipset, is coming out with a new generation that has new technology that should give 4 to 5 times the range. At least that's the promise. And Walksnail is going to be integrating that into their goggles. But only the Goggles X, not the V1 Fat Shark goggles. So if you want to take advantage of that, then you're going to want to buy the Goggles X. But you should know that Walksnail says that that is targeted for August 2024. And if history is any guide, it will not come out in August 2024. That's not a slam on Walksnail. That's just how the world is. They say they're going to release it on date X. And if you're lucky, it comes out on date Y, which hopefully is not too far from date X. But frankly, August 2024 is a long freaking way from today. So you have to ask yourself, am I going to spend $80 extra today on the promise that at some point, maybe a year-ish from now, I'll be able to get a new receiver, which will cost me more money, and a new set of video transmitters, which will cost me more money, that will give me 4 or 5 times the range? Or would I rather save $80 today, use the existing ecosystem of Walksnail video transmitters and camera, which is quite mature, and then maybe at some point a year or two from now, I'll upgrade? That's a question only you can answer. If the HDMI input or the AV input are killer features for you, if that was the one thing that was keeping you from going Walksnail when the V1 goggles came out, you said, what? I can't use it with my analog module? And then you went and bought a different set of goggles. If that was the one thing keeping you away from Walksnail, that problem has basically been solved. Neither the AV input nor the HDMI input give you the full maximum best performance of analog or HDZero, but if you wanted to, you could, and you could get a reasonably usable experience out of them. Especially as regards the AV input, I have to reiterate that there are many features here that are missing that you would expect from an analog goggle. Things like a DVR, things like the ability to adjust the brightness and contrast to compensate for the camera being a little bit out of whack. Those things are missing, and you just have to accept that you're not going to get them and be okay with it. And for those who say, well, these are digital goggles, what do you expect? The DJI V2 goggles recorded analog DVR, and they had adjustable brightness and contrast and so forth, I'm pretty sure. Can't remember 100% on the brightness and contrast. So it's not a lot to ask that Walksnail would have these. And for those who are saying, well, maybe they'll add it in a future firmware update, from what I'm hearing, no, the hardware doesn't allow them to do a DVR on the analog. You're just not going to get that. You're going to need to find some other solution for that if that's important for you. You could do a recorder on the HDMI out. That is an option, just a clunky one. For some people, the V1 goggles are going to be the better choice, specifically people who don't like the optics on the V2 goggles. The 50-degree field of view on the V2 goggles means that it is impossible for me to see the corners fully sharp all the way to the side, and the placement of the goggles on my face is very, very picky to maximize the amount of the screen that I can actually see. It's too large of a field of view for the optics. In my opinion, it should have been smaller. I'm only one guy and one set of eyes, but that's the truth for me. In addition, if you have an extreme glasses prescription between about -6 and -8 diopters, in my experience, the V1 goggles were able to be adjusted to match my eyes perfectly, and these ones are not. It seems like they have just a little bit less diopter adjustment. So that may be a deal breaker for you. Some of you are saying at this point, Bardwell, you haven't mentioned the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi capability that the goggles have. You're right, I haven't. The goggles have a Bluetooth and Wi-Fi chipset built in, and Walksnail has said that they're going to be developing an app to do I don't know what, and maybe they will, they probably will, but that's the kind of thing that is sort of promised for the future, and even if it does manifest, who knows how useful it'll be. I don't think that's something that you should make your buying decision based off of today. It's a nice to have, not a need to have, and if it turns into something great, but I just wouldn't count on it at the time that I'm spending my money today. if you're interested in picking up the Walksnail Goggles X, there are links down below in my video description, and it means a lot to me when you use those links because they're affiliate links. That means I get a small commission every time you make a purchase at the affiliated store after you click that link. It doesn't actually matter what you buy, whether you buy these goggles or just your normal everyday FPV shopping. When you click that affiliate link and then make a purchase, it supports me, and it means a lot to me when you use those links. But if you are going to buy these goggles, and what you want from them is kind of a jack of all trades that lets you do analog, Walksnail, and HDZero maybe, I really think that you should look at my review of the HDZero goggles, because the HDZero goggles are actually a better all-around choice. They are better at doing HDZero because they support the full 90 FPS, the ultimate lowest 2 millisecond, 4 millisecond latency, and nothing else gives you that experience. Not the standalone HDZero receiver, nothing. They are better for analog because they have a better analog display, low latency, comb filter, and a great analog DVR. And they are better for Walksnail because with the Walksnail standalone receiver, you actually get the full 100 FPS input with very little additional latency. If you're looking for an all-around choice, then the HDZero goggles deserve a serious look. They are a lot more expensive, though. Like a lot more expensive, especially when you buy all the other receivers and stuff. So what I want to do is I want to put a card on screen to my review of the HDZero goggles. And so you can decide for yourself which of these is better for you. I'll see you over there. Happy flying.